You're listening to Compliance Conversations, your inside scoop on all things healthcare compliance, auditing, and coding. Now, let's get on with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Compliance Conversations. I am CJ Wolf with Healthicity, and I'm so excited for today's guest, Ericka Adler, who is a healthcare attorney at Roetzel Andress. Welcome to the podcast, Ericka.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
We are so grateful for your willingness to share your expertise. You have a wealth of experience, and we'd love to always let our guests introduce themselves a little bit, share what you're comfortable sharing about what you're doing or how you came to this, anything that you'd like to share about yourself, and then we'll jump into today's topic.
Sure, happy to. So I'm a healthcare attorney. I've been practicing, I don't know, about 28 years or so now. And I run our healthcare practice. We represent thousands of physicians and healthcare practices around the country. And we primarily are on the provider side. So we work with a lot of physicians on their practices, their day-to-day issues, selling their practices, whether to each other, to hospitals, to private equity. And we have a big focus on regulatory healthcare. So we work with them not only on their day-to-day regulatory issues, but many of the regulatory issues that come up when we're trying to do a transaction. And so really, my experience has spanned many years. I've seen, these practices operate before these particular laws came into play, and now that
Right.
So I've really kind of seen how things have changed over the years. And it's kind of the toughest time now as compared to ever before to be a healthcare provider and to run a healthcare practice and to have to deal with a lot of the compliance issues that are out there. So really excited to kind of be here and talking about some of those challenges.
Well, I appreciate that feedback and kind of that background. I've been in healthcare compliance about 25 years. I may have not mentioned this to you before, but I'm an MD by schooling and got into healthcare compliance over 25 years ago. So I haven't been practicing for that whole time, but my colleagues and my friends kind of repeat exactly and echo what you just said. It's a hard time to run a medical practice. There's economic pressures, there's market pressures, and so practices sell and there's different things, and that's a whole process. And so I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast today to talk about what some of those issues are. And for all our listeners, we'll try to include a link to the practice so that all of you can reach out to Ericka and the firm afterwards if you have questions or need their services. So, Ericka, we're going to talk about acquiring practices, selling practices, and all the things that go along with that. And Ericka, I'd just like to kind of start with maybe, most of our audience is a compliance audience, and love to start with just a general question of what do you feel are some of the common compliance issues that come up or arise when a practice, during the sale or purchase of a medical practice, and then how can those issues impact the whole transaction?
That's a great question. So obviously, depending on who the parties are, there are more or fewer compliance issues. So if we're talking about a small practice selling to a private physician buyer, unfortunately, they're probably using their own lawyers who aren't asking the right questions on either side. So a lot of times we have the buyer just taking on a practice without being familiar with asking the right compliance questions and maybe even adopting and continuing some of those very same compliance issues once they take on the practice. Okay. In larger transactions, let's say a hospital's involved, we definitely start seeing more interest in asking some compliance questions. Okay. And then, of course, there's the private equity transaction. There is no more thorough compliance investigation than in a private equity deal. And I've spent a lot of time over the past 5 years doing a lot of transactions, and I'm always completely amazed by the amount of compliance investigation that is done. And in a lot of our transactions, there will literally be two law firms on the side of the private equity buyer, one just for compliance issues and one
Wow.
business transaction. So the process is very involved. However, whether you're selling or buying a practice and it's amongst smaller practices or whether it's a very large transaction, the compliance issues are the same. You just may not be aware of them or asking the right question. The most typical issues that we focus on are going to be billing. Okay. So,
Sure.
a practice that's buying another practice may just be buying its assets. So it's thinking, oh, we're going to start a new practice. We have a new provider number. We don't even need to worry about that. Okay. Maybe that's true. Maybe not. However, from a private equity perspective or a larger buyer perspective, they are going to do a coding audit. They want to know, how did you bill? How long are you billing that way? Are you billing? Are you coding properly? Are you documenting properly? And a lot of that is really to make sure that they're correcting things before you go forward, if possible, but also to say, hey, you're doing incident 2 and you're not doing, the oversight or supervision properly. Well, that has to end. Okay. We have a lot of buyers. Sometimes they don't allow incident 2. Incident 2 is permissible by Medicare, but their internal policy don't allow it. Okay. So they are really trying to, it's an investigative process to find out what are you doing right or wrong, but also, how do we want things done once we do this deal? So there's that part of it. Secondly is a financial audit. Obviously in smaller transactions, your local accountant might be looking at something. In these larger transactions, they're doing quality of earnings. They're looking at all the accounting that was involved. But there's another part of the financial audit that's important that has to do with healthcare, which is when you have a physician practice, if that practice is billing Medicare and offering any kind of designated health services, they need to comply with Stark, right? And part of complying with Stark is that you're a group practice. So part of the audit process is, are you truly a group practice? And the group practice has many different components. Are the physicians on average spending enough time with the practice? If they are they billing properly? Are they doing anti-markup billing properly, right? So there's a lot of investigation. Right. And a big piece of that is the compensation formula that the doctors are using needs to comply with Stark. And so during this process, we often find that it's not compliant if it's a sophisticated enough diligence process. And so they want to know because it reveals a Stark violation potentially, but also they then know that once they do the deal, we need to change how things are being done. Because a lot of times a buyer will say, hey, we're going to take you on and we're just going to, you guys are doing great. We're just going to have you continue doing what you're doing once we acquire you. But this will be something that can continue. Okay. It also opens the door to a Stark violation. And we can talk a little bit about what happens with some of the information that's discovered during diligence. Another piece of it would be the HIPAA investigation. And that includes not only wanting to look at business associate agreements, but asking a ton of questions about, have there ever been complaints? How do you handle complaints? Have you ever had an actual audit done of your actual, your systems and your process? Was it done by an outside party? A lot of my doctors will do it themselves and just say they did it, never document it. So they don't even have a policy on it, right? So the size of the parties that are involved in the deal also dictate whether the answers are going to be, no, we don't have that. Yes, we do have that. Employment, that's something a lot of people don't think about, but there's an audit process. Are people classified properly as employees versus contractors? I've had deals off because the buyer doesn't think that the seller should have been calling people contractors. They should have been employees, and they felt that there was a liability for them. So that's a big piece of it. They look, are there complaints about discrimination, harassment? Are there any lawsuits going on? What kind of things have been happening in your practice? We don't want to take that on. We don't want to absorb that liability, right? And then just an overall compliance audit. What kind of marketing are you doing? Are you paying kickbacks? Are you disclosing relationships, self-referrals, and that compliance blanket is very large. So when we do this compliance process, it literally could be hours and hours of phone calls and questions, in addition to production of documents to get to the heart of all of these different questions. So I'm kind of summarizing it very globally, but there are so many questions as you dive into it. And each one could lead to the exposure of liability. Billing issues could be, exposure to private or Medicare billing issues. We've got potential OIG issues. We've got IRS issues. We've got
Right.
or OCR issues. So the reason for going through all this is to find out what is out there, and at the end of the day, how do we respond to those questions? So, a lot of times when we're doing a deal, we may be representing somebody for the deal. They were not our client before. So we're
Right.
not familiar with their options. We don't have a chance to kind of spend that time with them to ask these questions before they go to sell. And so a lot of this stuff might be coming up just during diligence. And so we're trying to respond to it, but it becomes very clear that almost every single practice out there is non-compliant in many ways, not just one,
Yeah.
in many ways. So
Yeah, I can totally see that, because sometimes I'm brought in as a consultant to, a compliance program, or their ownership will ask, can you just evaluate our compliance program? Do we have the 7 elements? How effective are we? And sometimes when I go in, I'll say, show me your log of, audits and refunds, right? Oh, we don't have any refunds. We're perfect. And I'm like, that worries me a little bit more, because no one's perfect. And I'm interested in your perspective. Is it a negative perception if they have a robust compliance program that, yeah, look, every month we do audits, and occasionally we have to return money to Medicare or Medicaid because we found that we coded, 1 level too high or 2 level too high. I would think that would be a little bit more comforting for an investor or a buyer,
yeah,
versus when they say we have no refunds.
if you have, even if you've been audited and you respond to those immediately and you refund, very few private practices are having themselves regularly audited. Very few have compliance plans. Okay, so when there
Okay.
is a situation where somebody says, yeah, we have this, we bring someone in, we refund automatically, we do education and training. Ooh, that's like gold star, right?
Gotcha.
Would have a problem with that. The problem is those practices that have never been audited until the buyer does it, and there are quite a few things wrong. And how far back did it go? Was it fraudulent? Was it indifference? So then we have to
Right.
with it. And of course, the bigger ones are the ones that would violate Stark or anti-kickback, because at that point it becomes
Exactly.
a question as to whether or not they want to continue with the transaction. And unfortunately, those come up very often in these deals. So
Makes sense. So how do you think physicians can ensure then their practice is in compliance before even putting it on the market? Like, how do you get your house in order?
that's a great question. I recommend that at least a year before you want to sell, that you're working with a healthcare lawyer and you're going through what the questions are that a buyer would be asking you. And
Okay.
it's true that saying yes, we didn't have a compliance plan, but now we do. It only goes back 1 year. Okay, it's not going to solve all your problems, but it certainly
Right.
effort. We would usually recommend you get an audit done. What's going on with your billing? Are you doing incident to properly? Are you meeting the anti-markup requirements? What do we see that's a problem? Do we want to go to the market right now? Do we need to wait a certain amount of time? Do we need to refund money, make sure our house is clean? So
Right.
I usually think it does take quite a period of time to prepare if you want to have a smoother transaction. Often, doing that can get you a higher purchase price, right? Uh,
Yes.
it can decrease the likelihood of money being put aside because of all the problems they found, right? It can
Right.
your deal goes through as opposed to the buyer being unhappy with what they find and calling things off, right? And your legal fees would be far less at the end of the day, because the amount of time we spend trying to work on these issues when you're trying to do a deal, it becomes much more expensive than if we had kind of planned ahead of time. So there is a lot that can be done to kind of prepare. I'll give you a good example. Nobody's checking the
Yeah.
database. It's so easy. It's free. Is anybody checking the OIG database to see if the employees working for them are excluded? No,
Right.
I haven't done a single transaction where the selling entity has indicated that's something that they do. Okay, so not a single one ever. So, there's just little things like that, that if we could put protocols in place and we can make sure things are cleaned up, it's so easy to do that. And then, of course, for the more major things, their compensation formula is wrong. They're violating START. We could help them address that. So they could disclose, yes, there was a problem. Yes, we self-disclose. Yes, we believe we are compliant. A buyer would love to hear that. So I think it's getting ready ahead of time can really make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We're going to take a quick break, everybody, and then we're going to come right back and talk some more about these important issues when it comes to selling your practice or purchasing a practice. So hang in there for one moment, everyone.
Compliance is complex, which is why you should visit Healthicity's Resource Center. It features updates on the OIG's new General Compliance Program guidance, CEU webinars, and more. Visit healthicity.com/resources today.
Welcome back from the break, everybody. We're talking with Ericka Adler about all the intricacies of practices when they're selling, when they're acquiring, and we've talked a lot about practices getting ready. Maybe, Ericka, we talk a little bit now about from the buyer's perspective. So for buyers, tell us a little bit about the due diligence that should be performed to identify any compliance red flags, and how can those risks maybe be mitigated during this discovery process?
Sure. So, I think the buyer perspective is really just the flip side of what we've been talking about. They need to ask all these questions, and depending on the information that they gather, they need to decide, are we going to proceed? I think the answers to these questions fall into different categories. If they're buying the assets of a practice, can they separate themselves enough so that whatever they found out doesn't really matter? Okay. Can put indemnification language in the agreement that no matter what, they're going to be protected from whatever it is they discovered? Can they modify whatever the practice was doing wrong, but yet preserve the value of the practice? Because obviously they're buying it, it's financially successful. But if they were to fix all these things, would it still be financially successful? If we correct all the things that were being done wrong, over coding, classifying employees wrong, whatever the thing done, if we correct all these things, is it still a valuable practice? What do the financials look like at that point? Right. So we need to be able to look at all these things and be able to feel comfortable as a buyer that we can segregate the liability and still move forward and have a successful transaction. If we feel the risk is too high, we may walk away. We may decide to restructure the transaction a different way that separates us a little bit more in terms of kind of the transaction entities or the structure. We might decide to restructure the kind of the purchase price or the payment timing to make sure that we pass certain time periods before purchase price amounts are released. Okay, so and so there are different things a buyer can do to evaluate how badly they believe the discoveries are, but going into a transaction without asking these questions is a bad idea. And by the way, I know the private equity is really interested. They're not going to do a deal unless they do all this. But I have seen in very small practices, the failure to ask these questions also can be a real problem. Even if you just, let's say you've been working at a practice and you're becoming an owner in the practice. When you become an owner in an existing practice, you're not buying its assets, you're buying units or stock. Right? You're becoming an owner of an entity that may have done all these things wrong. So even doing that, you need to ask a lot of these same questions. Are you being sued? Have you filed your taxes on time? Have we ever done a compliance audit? Like, you should be interested as a potential owner of even a small practice in asking these kinds of questions. So whether you're buying or selling, I think we need to ask these same questions. The buyer wants to make sure that they are okay and satisfied and decide, do we change the transaction? Do we go through with it? The seller wants desperately, of course, to fix these things as much as possible and to help the deal still go through, right? So, they're kind of hopefully on the same team to make that happen. And of course, like we said, if you prepare ahead of time, it's a much smoother deal.
Yeah, it sounds very similar. You correct me if you don't feel this way. When somebody buys or sells a home, you fix up the landscaping, if you know the roof is old and you want a new roof, the seller pays to get a new roof. Or if that's discovered during some sort of home safety inspection, the buyer can say, well, if you don't fix the roof, take this much off the sales price because we're going to have to do it. Or the seller then says, okay, fine, we'll pay, we'll fix the roof, and now it's new. It sounds kind of similar to that, at least in the themes. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, diligence is diligence, right? If you're a smart
Right.
business person, you do your diligence, right? No matter what you're buying. I think the stakes are obviously higher. We're talking about a
Of
$50
course.
deal, and by the way, if you're a buyer, your lender wants to see certain
That's
things,
right.
going to give you the money. So it may not even be up to the buyer. It could be up to the lender to call off the
Sure.
deal, like what they see either. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's really not up to the buyer at all. So yeah.
Yeah. If I could, let me throw out a hypothetical and you tell me how it might affect a transaction. And then I'd love to hear some other real world examples that you might have. But so I do a lot of, medical coding and medical necessity reviews and that sort of thing. So let's say a practice's revenue, half of that revenue or a large portion of that revenue relies on the fact that a practice does an evaluation and management service and procedures on the same day, and they use a modifier 25. I don't know if you're familiar with all those coding details, but let's say somebody does an audit and say, you know what, you should not have been billing both the E&M and the procedure. Now your revenue shouldn't really be what you're saying it is, because you were showing way more revenue because you were billing both the E&M and the procedure. Do those type of specific examples come up? And is that a good example, or do you have any other real world examples like that?
I think that's a great example. I mean, that's the kind of thing that comes up in an audit, and then they need to evaluate, okay, if we extrapolate the samples that we
Right.
look at across the board, we're talking about a 25% reduction in your revenue, right?
Right.
You've been doing incident 2 wrong, right? And
That's right.
no longer bill incident 2, and nobody's there to supervise those people. How's that going to change your revenue? Right. So yeah, that has a direct impact. But it becomes a business issue. Like, we could correct things and do it properly going forward, but then they're going to do a whole new EBITDA evaluation or revenue evaluation and say, okay,
right.
practice is only worth this amount now. So this is what
That's
we're
right.
to pay you for it. And at that point, the buyer may not be interested in a practice worth that much. A seller may not be interested in selling for that much. So it can really change the outcome, not to mention the whole process of finding out that you've done something wrong and now need to potentially refund and which is a whole other issue, right? So we didn't even talk about that. But, in terms of billing audits that are performed, we have many times discovered stark and billing issues that have to be self-disclosed. So the process for that, and I'm sure you've covered this maybe before on your podcast here, involves a self-disclosure to the government, and we kind of, figure out what we think the amount is. We explain how we came up with that amount, and it can take quite a few years to resolve or even, hear something back, right? So we go to the transaction, and that's all kind of in limbo at that point, right? So the buyer then says, okay, we discovered this. You're willing, mea culpa, say we did something wrong. You've gone to the government. We won't hear anything back. So everybody kind of needs to do their best guessing on how to move forward at that point. But that has been an outcome quite a few times in our transaction. And I'll tell you, despite the fact that as compliance people, we always tell our clients what the government is looking for them to do, there's a lot of doctors that will take our advice and say, we appreciate that, and we will decide whether we want to do that or not. So there's definitely deals where clients will say, we're going to terminate this transaction, and I'm sure they never self-disclose, right? I can't force them to do that. And of course, there's this whole body of people out there that know about this issue now. Hopefully that's covered by the NDA, but that's a common occurrence as well.
Yeah. And, as somebody who's worked both in-house and for compliance programs and organizations, physician practices, hospital systems, as well as a consultant, I've seen kind of different responses just the way that you've suggested. Thank you for your opinion. We don't agree. We're not going to go that route. And, a lot of our listeners, we cover this topic in some other episodes where, you have to recognize that when you start doing due diligence, people in both organizations are going to know, but let's say you're the selling practice and your billing manager gets involved and finds out that that billing manager has told you for years you shouldn't have been billing this way. Now you have this external party telling them the same thing. The practice doesn't do anything. Internally, you have a potential whistleblower. Everyone knows the False Claims Act, those whistleblowers can receive a percentage of the recoveries. And so you just have to be careful from a compliance perspective. I always preach, just do the right thing. It's sometimes not worth those risks. But again, yes, those are
Yeah,
business decisions.
absolutely. And definitely, I mean, in most of our transactions, the owners of the practice will actually manage to do quite well to keep anybody from the practice kind of knowing about what's going on. We'll bring in an auditor and hire them through us to keep everything attorney-client privilege. But the
Right.
fact is that once an issue is discovered, it becomes a real legal and moral dilemma as to what the right thing to do is. And I think usually our clients, they want to do the right thing. If it's a lot of money, it's harder for them to do the right thing.
Right.
It can be very hard, especially with all the financial challenges that smaller practices are facing. And the rules are so complicated. I mean, you've been doing this a very long time, and I don't know. I mean, nobody can know everything about everything. Almost every part of every statute is its own specialty, right? And
That's
it's
right. That's
really
right.
hard. When it comes to, you might have a billing issue. When it comes to Stark, that's a black and white statute. There's civil liability there. I make it very clear to my clients that they have an obligation. Anti-kickback statute is criminal liability. We often will find out some things we don't like to hear when we're reviewing compliance. Things like, oh, you're letting the doctor who refers to you lease the space for free, or you never did a fair market value the rent that's being paid. Oh, you drop off hockey tickets and gifts regularly to your best referral sources. They're not complying with
Yeah.
they're not complying with the anti-kickback statute, and this all comes out during diligence. Okay, so those are very real life issues that come up. I always try and talk to my clients before we have those calls. I'm like, is there anything? Not that we wouldn't disclose it, but yeah, tell me now, because it's better to say we used to do this, but we don't do it anymore. As of when.
Right.
Like 2 weeks ago, we stopped when Ericka said we shouldn't do it anymore, but at least, showing the knowledge and the idea that you are pursuing, the right way to do things is always,
Yes.
um, even things like HIPAA. So, HIPAA is so easy to comply with. There's online programs, there's forms of BAAs, and it's just the small practices are just so overwhelmed. They lose track. They don't do their BAA. And, to be honest, most of them don't really face HIPAA, complaints very regularly. But, look at all these practices that are associated with large hospital systems that are having, HIPAA issues. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to alert their patients. They don't alert their patients. Their patients hear it on the news. So there's just so much education involved in the whole process that it's better to get your education from your own lawyer and not from buyer's counsel. That's just the there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Ericka, this has been fascinating. We're kind of coming to the end. So in a moment, I'd love to hear if you have any last minute thoughts or advice. But I love hearing from you and from individuals in your perspective, because as in-house compliance officers, this is what we're preaching all the time, but it sometimes feels like no one believes us. And then when you have a financial transaction that's going to happen and you have the people like yourself say the same things, it's like redemption hour. And it's like, yes, this is going to go a long way for improving our compliance program. So I love hearing this. It validates a little bit of how I feel I'm practicing as a compliance officer, because sometimes it's a lonely world. And then to hear people from your perspective to say, no, these are real issues and they can throw a wrench into transactions. So that's really refreshing for me. I know it's refreshing for our listeners. What last minute thoughts or advice or anything else that you'd like to share before we close up today?
I guess the best piece of advice is that people need to really just, it doesn't take a lot of time or a lot of effort to clean up your house, right?
Right.
work with somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who does this kind of work. When it comes to selling your practice, just take a few hours, run through, be prepared. You don't want to be surprised. I tell you, like, I've had 2 deals recently, 20 million plus deals that were terminated because of compliance issues. Can you imagine
Wow.
your career, building practice, and if you had only taken the time, spent a little bit in legal and compliance fees to be properly advised, that you would not have lost those deals, right? And I'm not saying they can't clean things up and
Right.
forward, but the regulatory environment for transactions in healthcare have changed a lot. They may never get that same purchase price. They may never find a buyer. It could take a lot longer than they intended to practice in the first place, since a lot of people use selling a practice as an exit strategy, right, or retirement. So I just say,
Right.
your resolution for 2025, if you own a healthcare business, not just practices, by the way, DME companies,
Right.
home
That's
health,
right.
hospice, nursing homes, everybody needs to run these exact same steps to clean up what's going on. It makes it a better business. It protects you from ongoing liability, not just selling, but ongoing liability. And then
Right.
if an opportunity arises to sell, you can sit tight and know that they're not going to find anything because you did your homework. So I think that is the best piece of advice. I recommend it to all my clients. Everybody should be doing it. And it costs a lot less and, makes you feel reassured that you're complying with the law. So,
Ericka, I think that last 60 to 90 seconds of hearing you speak is what I would recommend all our listeners to download and play it for your C-suite when you're having issues trying to implement compliance strategies, to say, look, if you're ever planning on selling or ever planning to be purchased, just listen to Ericka. She's been doing this for 28 years and listen to this, because I think that goes a long way. So thank you for sharing that.
my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate your expertise, and to everyone who listens, we appreciate your time and listening. As always, we invite you to share with us other topics that you'd like to hear about, and or if there are certain experts like Ericka that would make great guests, please feel free to send that to us. We'd love to have them on to discuss these important topics. And so until next time, everyone, take care.